Dr. Irving Berkowitz has been the Dean of Academic Affairs at Palm Beach State College since 2013. He is the son of survivors at the most infamous extermination camp of the Nazi Holocaust, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Dr. Berkowitz is a widely respected scholar and public speaker on the Holocaust and contemporary anti-Semitism. In 2016, Dr. Berkowitz was awarded a Holocaust Fellowship to the Harvard of Holocaust Studies, the prestigious International School for Holocaust Studies in Jerusalem, where he was a scholar in residence. In 2018, Dr. Berkowitz completed a fellowship as a scholar in residence at Oxford University, their renowned Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, with a small group of the brightest minds in the world devoted to advancing our knowledge of the roots and ramifications of global anti-Semitism. In 2019, Dr. Berkowitz received the 2019 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Distinguished Leadership Award for a lifetime of leadership, scholarship, advocacy, and service in relation to racism, anti-Semitism, hatred, and discrimination. I am so proud to call him a dear friend, a Gross Family Center board member, and a towering figure in his field. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome back Dr. Irving Berkowitz.
That it's a great honor to be returning for what I believe is my 6th year as a speaker at the Gross Family Center for the Study of Antisemitism and the Holocaust. I've said this to you before, and I'll say it again. This organization hosts the finest lecture series, certainly in the state of Florida, and I believe in the country. And I speak all over the country. And I'm glad that Lauren acknowledged her parents, because what the Gross Family Center has done in the wake of a growing disinterest in the Holocaust, in the face of rising anti-Semitism around the world, the Gross Center continues to sponsor scholars like me to talk about the Holocaust. And I have to tell you, in recent years, especially this past year, I've been contacted by organizations that have said to me, Dr. Berkowitz, we would love to invite you to speak to our group, but we just don't want to hear about the Holocaust. As a matter of fact, the other day, I got a call from a group, goes unnamed, that said, we'd like you to talk about the liberation of Auschwitz, but we want you to end it on a happy note. I said I'll try my best to do that. But ladies and gentlemen, let me, before I launch into today's lecture, let me tell you that I have deferred to other scholars the study of the brighter side of humanity. No lecture I give, and none of the work I've done in all the years I've been doing this, is but about the darker side of humanity. The things that we are capable of doing and the things that we did when it came to the Holocaust. At some point, I'm going to do something today that I made a rule I would never do. I would never try and make a comparison between the Holocaust and any other genocide of the 20th and 21st centuries. And by the way, you should know, and maybe this is a reflection of what we have or haven't learned, is that since the Holocaust, there have been no less than 90 genocides. 90 genocides since the Holocaust. I don't like to get into an argument with anybody about our genocide was worse than your genocide, but recently a scholar, someone I know, came out and claim that actually the murder rate of the Rwandan genocide of 1994 was far greater than the Holocaust. I'm not going to get into that at the moment, but I will, in a matter of minutes, I will dispel that myth. The Holocaust, ladies and gentlemen, is to me similar to the concept of the speed of light. As Einstein once said, there is nothing that comes close to the speed of light. And when you think about the numbers, the astronomical numbers, who can wrap their minds around the fact that light travels at 186,000 miles per second? Per second. Well, astronomers, and I'm an amateur astronomer, astronomers had to come up with a concept that measures the distance that light travels not in 1 second, but in 1 year. And as you know, they called that a light year. Light travels 6 trillion miles in 1 year. 6 trillion miles in 1 year. And so when an astronomer says we're looking at a galaxy that's 10 billion years old, take 10 billion times 6 trillion. Can anybody tell me what that number is? We can't. We have a name for it. But in 1944, Winston Churchill, speaking in the United States, already aware for 2 years, the Allies were aware of the genocide taking place. And Winston Churchill in a speech said, we are confronted with a phenomenon for which we have no name. What do you call this? Hyper-intense murder of one people. And along comes Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish jurist from Poland, and he creates the word genocide. Genos, from the Greek, genos, race, a people, and side, from the Latin, the murder of a people. And in the very first meeting of the United Nations adopts a convention for the prevention and prosecution of genocide. So let me get back then to our talk today, because the question is, how is it possible for the Nazis to have exterminated 6 million Jews? How is it that that just simply doesn't compare to any other genocide in history? And of course, I did forget one thing, and this is the image you're seeing now. I want to dedicate today's talk to the aunts and uncles that I never knew. Uncle number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, these are my uncles. And 1, 2, 3, those were my aunts. 9, that were my father's brothers and sisters. My father was a survivor. And like 75% of all Holocaust survivors, they were the sole survivors of their entire families. I'm also dedicating this talk to a guy that looks like me. This is my great-grandfather, my great grandfather Isaac, one of the great Jewish leaders and rabbis in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Rabbi Isaac Friedman, I named my own son after my great-grandfather Isaac. And this is dedicated to him as well. So, you come to a lecture and you expect to receive at least one $20 word for the day. And so the word of the day is ferroequinology. Does anybody know what ferroequinology is? Well, let's deconstruct it. What is ferrous? And what is equine? So today's talk is about the iron horse, which is the train. And so what is a ferroequinologist? Well, yeah, I think its origin was somebody who has this passion for trains, somebody that studies trains, studies them to the point of being fascinated by everything from the power of a locomotive, to the tracks, to the uses of a train, to even saving tickets from a train ride. Well, today a ferroequinologist may be someone like me, who as a little boy had a fascination with trains, and every boy I knew wanted a Lionel train. How many of you remember Lionel trains? Thank you. So I'm going to share with you a little piece of trivia. Lionel Trains was going bankrupt. And along comes a ferroequinologist some 15 years ago who decided he was not going to allow that to happen. And so he bought the company to keep Lionel Trains alive. His name? Neil Young, the singer Neil Young. Neil Young owns Lionel Trains. But now, what's this word foamers? Where does this come from? Well, you can imagine that somebody that has this obsession with trains, they say when they see a train or they hear the sound of a distant train whistle, they foam at the mouth. Well, imagine that. Now, I want you to contrast that with the Holocaust survivor 80 years ago. I want you to imagine the memories, the horrifying memory, the sentient experience of being on a Holocaust death train, a sealed boxcar with one window, with no heat, no way to cool off. So if you happen to be transported in the dead of winter, you froze. Or conversely, in summer, as many did during members of my family during the infamous Hungarian transport from May to July, they were overcome with heat exhaustion. Oh, and no water, but one bucket for the start of the trip, and the second bucket was their latrine. The average train ride for a Holocaust victim was 4 days. 4 days was the average. And that average often got extended because the priority was on the use of train track to prosecute the war. But ladies and gentlemen, Germany was in two wars. And I don't mean World War I and World War II. What I mean is that Germany prosecuted a second war against the Jews. It fought its war with the West, and it fought its war with the ultimate efficiency against the Jews. The problem is that the warring factions, the East and the West, the Axis and the Allies, had partners. The Jews had none. The Jews had no allies. Yes, I'll mention at the end of the talk those that were chosen as righteous among the nations. Some of the very countries with the highest death rates, the Netherlands, the Dutch, who lived with this myth of decades of being the heroes that Jews needed to thank for saving. Finally came to grips with their real history, the real history of how Dutch Jews were persecuted, how Dutch Jews were hunted down by the Dutch and turned in. All 77,000 that died on their Nederländische Spoorwegen, the Netherlands National Railway. Oh, in America we call them railroads. In Canada and in Europe they call them railways. So let's get to the premise of this lecture. Why Lauren said there's not been much done to study the Holocaust from the standpoint of the rail car experience. And I have spent the better part of the past year doing this. And so what is it that we all ought to know or remember about trains? We know how central trains were in the Industrial Revolution. The first train was invented in 1803 in Great Britain, but the first major railway was established in Russia. We're very familiar with the meeting of the transcontinental railroads, the New York, the Central Railroad and the Union Pacific meeting in the middle of the country. Two of the largest trains in America, Union Pacific. BNSF, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, Norfolk Southern. These trains are enormous businesses. And the Union Pacific Railroad played a significant role, as railroads have since, in wartime. Think about the difference between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. One big difference. It was the train. The train that could transport troops, that could transport armaments, that could transport supplies, and could support a strategy that without such transport could never have been implemented. I want you to think about the fact that the Deutsches Reichsbahn, the German National Railroad, the railroad that is today in 2022, the largest railway in the world, with an annual revenue of $51 billion. And what is the second largest railroad in the world? A railroad that was also culpable in the Holocaust. The railroad mentioned by Lauren, what's called the SNCF. SNCF. We're just going to call it the French National Railway. We'll get into that more later. But let's start with the Deutsche Reichsbahn. And before I do, just for the benefit of all of you, let's just go back over and set the stage for World War II. You have the Axis powers, which are three: Japan in the east, Germany, and Italy. They all sign an agreement by 1937. Japan wants to establish an empire in the east and don't want the Germans interfering. Germans say fine. And Germany, of course, Hitler really does envision a 1,000-year Reich, a new world order. Even the capital of the world being Germania. And during the war has his architect Albert Speer actually putting together designs because Hitler is so confident the war will be won. But okay, so on the Ally side, we have Great Britain and we have France. By 1941, the end, of course, after the bombing at Pearl Harbor, the Americans joined the war. But when did World War II start? It started in September 1939. Why? Because of Germany's invasion of Poland. That triggered Britain and France to declare war on Germany. But I want you to get the context of this. That was September 1939. What happened before that? So let's go back to 1938. In March of 1938, Germany decides that it's going to walk into its neighbor's country, Austria. And of course, we all know they call that invasion of Austria the Anschluss. The one thing you don't see in this German invasion of Austria are weapons. What you do see are the people by the millions lining the streets and welcoming Hitler and the Nazi regime. So don't believe everything you read about Austria having been occupied. Ladies and gentlemen, Austria was an ally of Germany. And because of the great work of Adolf Eichmann, I'll show you later on where Adolf Eichmann brags. He boasts about the fact of making Austria Judenfrei. Eichmann, in a matter of 1 year, using the Deutsche Reichsbahn, clears Austria of 200,000 Jews. And I have a copy of an article that appears in the New York Times in section B, page 15, about that. Okay. So we have the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, 1938. Later in 1938, Hitler decides he's got designs on the Sudetenland. I'll show you where that is later. The Sudetenland is a boundary, is a border area of Czechoslovakia. It was a Germanic-speaking territory that Germany lost in World War I. Hitler wants it back. And Britain and France decide, well, what are we going to do about this? We don't want him starting another war, so we're going to, without the permission of Czechoslovakia, we're going to give Germany the Sudetenland. That would be September 1938. March 1939, 6 months later, Hitler's not satisfied with just the Sudetenland, and he decides, I'm going to take Czechoslovakia. He invades Czechoslovakia in 1939. The Allies are scratching their heads, what are we going to do about this? But the country of Czechoslovakia now is conquered, and it's divided. It's divided into Moravia and Bohemia, and they create an independent state of Slovakia, where my family was from. That's 1939. That's March 1939. Now comes September 1939. And before the Nazis invade Poland in September 1939 to start World War II, Hitler has a meeting. Actually, his representatives, Ribbentrop and Molotov. You all familiar with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? That's the secret agreement that Stalin signs with Hitler, where the Soviet Union signs a pact, a non-aggression pact with Hitler. And they decide that as long as Germany's going to attack in September 1939, it's going to attack the western part of Poland, Russia is going to lay claim to the eastern part of Poland, bordering the Soviet states of Belarus and Ukraine. There's a setup here. There's a reason I'm giving you these details, because the train, the Deutsches Reichsbahn, plays a critical role here. The invasion of Poland starts World War II. And with the new strategy invented by the Germans called the Blitzkrieg, with lightning speed, Germany takes over from Poland. It goes from east, it goes west, and the first place it invades after Poland is Denmark. And after Denmark, Norway, 1939. After Norway, Belgium, 1939. After Belgium, the Netherlands. After the Netherlands, Luxembourg. We're now into 1940. After that, we're going after France. And how quickly did France fall? Within weeks, France falls. And after France, Yugoslavia. What I want you to realize is that Hitler now has created, he has conquered most of Europe, and in 1941, he goes after the biggest prize, which is what? Russia. But before we get there, let me step back a moment. The premise of this talk, ladies and gentlemen, is this. There simply is no way that the annihilation of the Jews could have occurred with the magnitude that it did, had it not been for two variables, two conditions. Number one, the capacity of the trains, of the Deutsche Reichsbahn trains, to deliver victims to the camps, to deliver them from ghettos to the camps. But the second condition was the capacity of the killing centers, of the death camps, to process the arrivals, to gas them, to cremate them, and to dispose of their bodies. Those two variables. The capacity of the camps to kill and the capacity of the trains to deliver the victims. And what you must know, it was not the trains that could not keep up with the camps. It was the camps, the killing centers, that simply couldn't kill faster than the trains could deliver victims. Do you understand that? That's how pivotal the role the trains were. The trains delivered the victims faster than they could be processed, and that is why the Holocaust achieved a hyper-intense murder rate. So there are all these iconic images I wanted you to see. What do you think of when you see an image? What comes to the mind of anybody seeing the image of Arbeit macht frei? What comes to one's mind when they see Jude, the Jewish star, which, by the way, didn't appear for the first time in the 20th century? You must know that Jews were required in the 15th century. Everywhere they lived, Jews were required to wear a Star of David. And you should know that during the Holocaust, children wearing the Star of David had no idea why. They were proud. They wore the Star of David with pride. Just long enough for some non-Jew to come up and kick them and punch them. But do you agree that too is an iconic symbol of the Holocaust? What does one think when one sees an image of Anne Frank? They think really about the innocence of the children who were murdered in the Holocaust. They think about not just Anne, but others. What might they have become? As a matter of fact, you should know when people are surveyed around the world and asked to identify individuals associated with the Holocaust, the image of Anne Frank is more recognizable, more identifiable than Hermann Goering, than Heinrich Himmler. And there is one other person, Elie Wiesel, 16 years old at Buchenwald. A man that is one of my heroes. This iconic image, anybody recognize this? Nobody knows the young man, but it is the iconic image of the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. Not only were the people of Warsaw already transported to Treblinka, Treblinka was not a concentration camp. Treblinka didn't have a selection point for, like Auschwitz, for those off to the left can live and those off to the right can't. Treblinka was a death camp. Those that arrived at Treblinka were gassed and cremated within 24 hours. 950,000 Jews. 950,000, second only to Auschwitz. And of course, the track leading to the gates of Auschwitz, and you see this image of the gas chamber crematorium. Well, would you say these are the most identifiable icons of the Holocaust? What about this one? Oh, I forgot to mention. The metonym. You've heard the word metonym. What is a metonym? A word, a phrase, a concept that literally comes to mean something else. When you see this, 6 million, are we talking about 6 million miles? Are we talking about 6 million paper clips? Are we talking about the $6 million man? We're talking about 6 million Jewish victims. This, the very number 6 million, for many of us, is the metonym for the Holocaust. And here then is another, one of the most iconic symbols. Any organization that has a museum, their prize is what? One of the freight cars, one of the cattle wagons. Yep, this is a picture of the inside of a boxcar. That's the extent of the light that's shown inside a boxcar. Again, I want to take you back to the horrifying experience of a Holocaust survivor who's riding in a train. I want you, if you have to, close your eyes and imagine that this car that's 27 to 30 feet long, that's about 7 feet wide and about 8 feet high. I want you to imagine that a space that small maybe can fit 50 people, but in fact carried as many as 200 in this small space. There's a reason why you're looking at this image like that. You see, this is how the cattle cars looked. You didn't have a bathroom to go to. You couldn't lay down and go to sleep. You have to imagine 4 days in the dark, in the cold. Imagine what the feeling is of being so crowded that you can't turn around. We are sentient beings. We experience through our senses. Imagine what it's like being touched. Not even touched, being so packed, you can't, if you fell asleep standing up to go to the bathroom. Forget your dignity. You got a bucket there and water that was gone in the first hour. Imagine the assault on your senses, on what you're seeing, if you could, what you're hearing. You're hearing children scream. You're hearing others going mad. Your olfactory senses are taking in the vile smell of vomit, of excrement, of urine. I'm not going to belabor the point. Do you get what I'm saying about the in the boxcar experience? Yes? Yes. Okay. As Lauren said, scholars didn't study this. We focused on personalities. We focused on Nazi leaders. We focused on the war. We focused on places like camps and ghettos. We focused on everything but the trains, the Holocaust experience that was a part of the trains. So what does Elie Wiesel remember when he first was taken to Auschwitz? We arrived at the station where the cattle cars were waiting. Ever since my book night, I pursued those nocturnal trains that crossed the devastated continent. Their shadow haunts my writing. They symbolize solitude, distress, and the relentless march of Jewish multitudes toward agony and death. I freeze every time I hear a train whistle. And I don't know how many of you know about Primo Levi, a great chemist, a scientist, an Italian, whose family originated in Spain, but left Spain as a result of the Spanish Inquisition. A survivor of Auschwitz. He wrote a book, Surviving Auschwitz. He couldn't sell 1,000 of them, but he wrote about his experience. This was a brilliant man. And he had this to say about the train. Always at the beginning of the memory sequence stands the train, which marked the departure toward the unknown. Unforgettable is the cruelty with which those otherwise innocuous convoys of ordinary freight cars were employed for extraordinary purposes. I'm amazed that we call them cattle cars and nobody thinks for a moment about, is that the way we should treat an animal? A cattle car is a cattle car, but is that acceptable too? Primo Levi survived Auschwitz, did everything he can to honor the memory of our people. He got so overwhelmed with depression that one day in 1987, he fell 3 floors inside the building he inhabited. And it was ruled a suicide. Primo Levi was the man who said, because there's Auschwitz, there cannot be a God. He was one of many who lost his faith in God. There could be no God if there was such a thing as Auschwitz. And look at what Elie Wiesel said. He said that Primo Levi died in Auschwitz 40 years later. It was Auschwitz, the experience, that he couldn't live with. Elie Wiesel said Primo Levi died in Auschwitz 40 years ago. So, the use of trains for genocide, these are images not of the Holocaust, these are images of another genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century. This is the genocide of the Armenians by the Ottoman Turks. 1.5 million Armenians transported to one place and then sent off on a march across the Syrian desert with nothing but their children. This was the use of trains made before Nazi Germany. Look at the size of these locomotives. And these were built by the Deutsches Reichsbahn. I should say they were constructed with the help of tens of thousands of Jewish slave laborers. The Jews not only built the railroad tracks that carried these 1,600 trains, 1,600 Holocaust trains. Imagine that. And because prosecuting the war and prosecuting the second war against the Jews were beginning to encroach upon each other, they started manufacturing this DB Deutschbahn 52 model, the most powerful steam-powered locomotive. Why? So that the trains carrying Jews, not just armaments, so that the trains carrying Jews could actually take more cars. Not 50 or 60, but 90 or 100 cars. Not loaded to by 100% capacity of 50, but 200. Why? To accelerate the murder rate. This is how much investment the Third Reich put into prosecuting its war against the Jews. I'm going to skip this, but for those of you interested, this just gives you some idea of the number of Jews that were in pre-war, the pre-war population and after. And I put that up there thinking if we had the time I could show you, well, look at the Netherlands, for example. The Netherlands, 77 convoys. The Netherlands, 140,000 Jews before the war, 105,000 dead. The highest murder rate of Jews in all of Western Europe. Now, highest murder rate, ladies and gentlemen, not the highest number. And so here's Poland, and here's where I'm going to take a moment to get back to the Rwandan genocide. I might write a piece about this. But the Rwandan genocide, you must know, in 1994 was a horrible, horrible genocide. Next door neighbors, people that the Tutsis grew up with their Hutu neighbors. The Hutus came over the next day with machetes and hacked them to pieces. 800,000 Tutsis were murdered in 100 days. And so when you hear that, you think to yourself, well, boy, how does that compare to the Holocaust? If you take the Holocaust between 1939 and 1945 and divide by 6 million, you know what? That means that the Rwandan genocide was actually more intense than the Holocaust. No, it wasn't. You can't take a 4-year period and compare it to a 100-day period. What you can do is take 100 days of the Holocaust, the peak murder rate, September, October, November 1942, and you come up with 1.47 million Jews in 3 months. Take 800,000 and divide it by 3 months. That's 8,000 a day, right? 100 days, 8,000 a day. Take that 1.47 million and divide it by 3 months, and you have a murder rate of 445,000 per month. No comparison. I rest my case. So I just felt I had to put a map up here so that you saw. I'm going over that. So Germany, it takes over Austria, and then it goes from Austria to Czechoslovakia. This would be the area right around here of the Sudetenland. But then 6 months later, Germany takes over Czechoslovakia. So now look at the size of Germany here. Well, then it turns its sights on to Denmark. And within weeks, it goes from Denmark, it conquers Norway, and then it starts heading south. It conquers Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, until it's ready in 1940 to attack France. France falls. In 1941, Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is invaded because their Nazi-leaning leader was deposed. The Germans decide to invade Yugoslavia, and they divide Yugoslavia and create the independent state of Croatia. By the way, the Croatians were and would become allies of Germany. And not just, so now we have not just Germany and Italy, but now we have Croatia in Yugoslavia, you have Romania, you have Bulgaria, all this in the Balkans. They're allies of Germany. Now look at this, all of this. And now we're ready for the big prize. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. The German invasion of Russia, of the USSR. Ladies and gentlemen, listen carefully. This front, from the Black Sea to the Baltic republics, the invasion by Germany of the USSR to this day remains the largest ground invasion in the history of warfare. Do you hear me? The largest ground invasion in the history of warfare is the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Listen to these statistics. Germany has amassed over a front that stretches 1,800 miles. The invasion was on a front 1,800 miles. Germany brought 4.5 million Wehrmacht soldiers, 4.5 million men in one invasion force, over 1,800 miles. 4.2 million German soldiers, 600,000 horses, 700,000 vehicles, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft, 7,000 pieces of artillery. Is this registering with you? How do you think all of that got to the front? By train. The Deutsche Reichsbahn was responsible for staging the largest ground invasion in military history. The success the Deutsche Reichsbahn had in getting Jews murdered was far greater than the success it brought the German Wehrmacht, because it simply couldn't meet the demands to prosecute two wars. So I mentioned to you that Germany signs a. Do you remember when Neville Chamberlain of the Prime Minister of Great Britain, remember when he's waving this sheet of paper talking about how he prevented war? You remember this? The fool that he was. He got a signed piece of paper from Hitler, and 6 months later, instead of so now you have, this is the Sudetenland. So just so that you know, if you can see that, ladies and gentlemen, this is that area outside. But then 6 months later, all of Czechoslovakia is conquered. Look at these rail lines. 1,600 trains from the farthest point, Salonika, in Greece, a trip of 16 days. 16 days in a sealed freight car. from Thessalonica, all leading to Auschwitz. There were 44 rail lines going in to Auschwitz-Birkenau. These white lines here, these are the scars. Jewish people think of the rail lines in Europe today, particularly in Poland, as scars on the earth. A lot of these lines aren't even used anymore. But they certainly were, and they were built by Jews to murder Jews. And so I want to share this part with you, if you'll allow me to. This is Hungary. This is, remember, Hungary. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses in World War I. Austro-Hungary. As a result, Czechoslovakia is created, Hungary is created, right? All these independent nations. You see this town here called Hust? This is in an area called the Carpathian Mountains. How many of you are familiar with the Carpathians? Okay. The Carpathian Mountains run from Slovakia. They form a crescent. From Slovakia, they go into Romania. And where it ends in Romania, it ends in Transylvania, where it's called the Transylvanian Alps. In fact, let me see if... Here you go. Here's Slovakia. You see that? You see this mountain range right here? This is the Carpathians, and this area right here was called Subcarpathia. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where my mother and my father were from, in two tiny shtetls in the Carpathians. The aunts and uncles that I showed you before, when I was a scholar at Yad Vashem, I not only know the trains they were on, I know the date they arrived at Auschwitz and when they were murdered, on the 24th of May, 1944. All of them. All of them. But I had one uncle who had another distinction. This was my father's oldest brother. His name was Mordechai. And you know, among Jewish people, the oldest, they called them Alter. The Alter Mordechai, Alter Mordechai. Mordechai, my uncle, was 6 years older than my father. Born in 1906, my father born in 1912. My father today would be 110. In 1941, just weeks after the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hungary, through its railroad, transported 18,000 Jews from Subcarpathia. Among those 18,000 were my uncle, Mordechai, my aunt, Sarah, and their 4 children. And here is the testimonial, the witness that saw them murdered when they were taken to Ukraine. Mordecai, Sarah, and their 4 children. Chaim was 9 years old. Malka was 7. Aharon was 5. And Frida was 3. Those kids would be my cousins that I never knew. And ladies and gentlemen, the Hungarian train took them to this point right here, from Hungary, and from here to this killing site. They were marched 90 miles. Marched 90 miles to Kamenets-Podolsky. I want you to understand something. This is an image of them next to the ravine where they're going to be shot. Ladies and gentlemen, any one of these people could be members of my family. On this day, 2 days, 23,600 Jews were shot. And that's where they ended up. On this testimonial, it says, status according to the source, murdered. And ladies and gentlemen, only because the state of Israel now has established a site where you can go back and track the Holocaust death trains, if you know what I know. And ladies and gentlemen, the rest of my family was on this train from Subcarpathia. On the 24th, that train was boarded days before. This is arrival from Subcarpathia. Look at the length of this. Any one of these people could be members of my family. Now look closely. You see that? That's the gas chamber. You see that? That's crematoria 1 and crematoria 2. Ladies and gentlemen, they're marching. As soon as they got to the platform, the train, they were marched directly to the gas chambers. They had no idea what they were looking at. Here they are. These are other members of the Hungarian transport. You should know that from May to July 1944, the largest remaining intact Jewish population of Europe was in Hungary. They were all that was left for a complete annihilation of the Jews. 800,000 Jews lived in Hungary before the war. And in this period, the Hungarian transport that killed my family, 440,000 Jews in 3 months because of the Hungarian death train. The famous selection point, and look at this. This might as well be the picture earlier of my family off of the Subcarpathian train marching closer to the gas chamber. These were the people that were not selected to live. Women with children. Children were the priority to kill. If you were a young woman that could be put to work, if you had a child in your hand, and there were actually some grandparents that figured it out. Have figured out that before they got to that selection point, the grandma would take the child in her own arms to save her daughter. I thought you'd be interested in this. This is a picture of Ukraine today. Wrap it up? Oh, yeah, really? Okay. Is anybody bored? No. Okay. Will you appeal to my boss back there to give me a little more time? Okay. So I'm going to accelerate to the end of this lecture. This is Adolf Eichmann. This is the work of Adolf Eichmann. At the Wannsee Conference, he produced this, showing that 11 million Jews could be murdered in Europe. These are the open cars. You should know that the Nazis, the Deutsche Reichsbahn, used coal cars. So much so that in 1942 there was a what they called a coal shortage in Germany. The German people could not get heat because they couldn't get coal. And they couldn't get coal not because there was a coal shortage, there was a coal car shortage. These are people in the dead of winter riding in an open coal car for 4 days. So, this is another iconic image. Everybody thought for a while after the war that this must have been a young Jewish girl. No, she wasn't. She was a young gypsy girl. Anna Maria Satella Steinbach. This iconic image, no less iconic than Anne Frank. What do you see? You see a girl. They called her the girl in the scarf. You see a girl who's confused, a girl who's frightened, a girl that doesn't know that only days later she and all of the members of her family would be murdered in Auschwitz. This girl was on the Netherlands train. And of course, one of the most famous passengers on the Netherlands train, I just wanted you to see these pictures. Look at this guy closing the door here. You see what I'm asking you? What do you suppose this man is thinking?
Another one dead.
Huh?
Some more dead.
Remember, the Dutch were terrible to the Jews. This guy didn't look at these people like he gave a damn. And what about this one? It was a job. I was just doing my job. No, you weren't. You weren't just doing a job. There was an ideological motivation. There was a hatred for Jews. But here, then, is the story of Anne Frank. So please bear with me. Give me a couple more minutes, please. Yes? Yes, okay. Just things that you wouldn't know that you'll learn from me about Anne Frank. Anne Frank, the irony. Her father realizes in 1933 with the ascension of Hitler, realizes he's got to get out of Germany. And where does he go? He seeks refuge in the Netherlands. He goes to Amsterdam. And this just the other day, I was telling a dear friend, it was the other day I was reminded of the story, a Titanic story. You know of all the famous people on the Titanic that went down, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, the founder of Macy's, John Jacob Astor, the richest man in America. Well, did you know that Edward Vanderbilt, of the Vanderbilt family, one of the richest families in American history, Edward Vanderbilt had a ticket, a first-class $5,000 ticket on the Titanic. 2 days before, his wife has this bad feeling about it. I think she spoke to a seer or something, and she said, I don't want to go on this. He gives his 2 tickets away, and the Titanic sinks without them. Edward Vanderbilt died 2 years later on the Lusitania. True story. Imagine you escape the Titanic and you seek refuge on the Lusitania. Imagine escaping Germany, thinking you're free, and going to Amsterdam and then being deported. So here, I don't know that anyone's ever seen this. This is the manifest. Anne Frank, ladies and gentlemen, was on the last train to Auschwitz. The last train to Auschwitz from the Netherlands. There they are, Annalisa Frank, Edith, her mother, Otto, her father, and Margot. I found out an interesting coincidence in studying this. Anne Frank was born on the 12th of June. Margot Frank was born on the 16th of February. I was born on February 16th, and my brother was born on June 12th. So this is, Anne Frank was taken to Auschwitz and then finally sent to Belsen camp, a horrible camp. And weeks before the liberation, I'm sure you know the story, only weeks before, Margot died 1 day before Anne. 1 day she died before Anne. And the two of them died only weeks before the liberation. This is the last train to Auschwitz on which Anne Frank was taken. And here's the memorial, but now let's go to the I want you to hear this poem. Please bear with me. This is a very, very moving poem. This is a poem written by a Holocaust survivor named Dan Pages. Read this with me. Here, by the way, the title of the poem is Written in Pencil in the Sealed Freight Car. That's the title of his poem, Written in Pencil in the Sealed Freight Car. And this is how it goes. Here in this transport, I am Eve with Abel, my son. If you see my elder son Cain, the son of Adam, tell him that and it stops. Here I am, Eve, with my son Abel on this transport. The only two things that would make you associate this with the Holocaust is one, the sealed freight car in the title, and two, is the transport. But what is the biblical connection here? Why is Dan Pages invoking the family of mankind? Eve is on a train, just like Holocaust victims were on a train. Eve is holding her son, just like mothers held their sons. Eve has this sense of impending doom because they don't know where this train is going, but they have a pretty good idea. But then all of a sudden the poem ends abruptly. Well, it ends, why? Why does it end that way? If you see my elder son Cain, the son of mine that killed my other son, tell him that what? Eve is clearly reflecting on the first murder and associating it with the murder of Jews. The abrupt ending of this poem, why? Is it because Eve doesn't know what to say? Do you think that's it? That she doesn't know what to say to Cain? Think about it. What does a mother say to a son who kills her other son? Can you be at a loss for words? Yeah. All right. 5 minutes, please. Give me 5 minutes. Can I have a vote of confidence here? 5 minutes, please. Okay. All right. All right. Now I will get to the end here. The other couple weeks ago, I attended a talk that a scholar of Lawrence gave, and the question at the very end was, so why did the Allies not bomb Auschwitz? What, are you okay if I finish this talk with that? Okay. You see what you'd have had to go through? You'd have been here another hour. Okay, so let me start here. You know, Elie Wiesel, his whole life, simply couldn't countenance how in the world the Allies, having known of what was happening by 1942, why would they not have bombed the camp? Why would they not have tried precision bombing the tracks? Why would they not have bombed the crematoria and gas chambers? Somebody even said, why not even bomb the electrified fences? Because come the evening, people could escape in the dark. Why? Well, I would tell you this story, but I'm not going to. These are two guys that escaped Auschwitz. There were only 144 people that escaped from Auschwitz. 2 of them lived and wrote a report about it, and got that report to the Allies before the Hungarian transport. We could have saved 440,000 Hungarian Jews because they provided them with the report. So here we go. The most perplexing question, let's just quickly, very quickly go through this. The Allies didn't know. How many of you believe that? If you believe that, let me sell you a windmill on the moon. Obviously, the evidence is overwhelming. The Allies knew years before. Well, another theory is that it would have been immoral for the Allies to kill the prisoners. Well, think about that. At any one time, had they bombed Auschwitz, they might have killed 100,000 Jews. That's if you're thinking only about how many Jews they would have killed as opposed to how many Jews they would have saved. But agreed that it was a tough decision to bomb and kill the people that were there. It's even said that Winston Churchill, when he was asked about it, said he thought, yep, we ought to bomb, but was persuaded by FDR and his group that the focus needed to be on prosecuting the war with Germany, not getting involved with Germany's war against the Jews. Why? Think about this. All the Nazi propaganda about Jews controlling and manipulating the Allies and so on. What do you think public support would have been if FDR had decided to divert resources to save Jews? So I want you to think about this. I don't like, but I'm associating the same decision by FDR with the same decision by Abe Lincoln. Abe Lincoln didn't publicly say we were fighting the Civil War to end slavery because he knew it would have diminished public support for the war. FDR maybe decided he's not going to save the Jews because if he was to make that his priority, it would have diminished the support for the war. In fact, I am convinced today that there are people that would have strongly advocated bombing the camps, not because they would have saved Jews, but because they would have killed Jews. So the diversion argument, I'm almost at 2 minutes, diversion argument. As a matter of fact, there was a bomber pilot who became a United States Senator. His name was George McGovern. George McGovern was leading a squadron of bombers that were bombing the IG Farben plant 3 miles away from Auschwitz. And they took images. And later on, George McGovern said, we absolutely should have bombed the out of them. So diverting resources, nah, because they were flying right over Auschwitz. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, the explanation is it was simply the anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism in the FDR administration, the anti-Semitism and the lack of any support for Jews anywhere among the Allies and especially in the United States. But we have George Bush in a ceremony here at Yad Vashem in which he comes out and says, we should have acted on what we knew. And finally, and this is where I'll end, here are the aerial images, proof that the Allies knew very well what was going on. These are, by the way, very rare, and these were not released but just recently. And I know you can't read these, but look what that says. This comes from the CIA released this. You see that gas chamber here? They even have, look at this, groups of prisoners. You see these?
Do they know how many actual people of the Jews died on the railroads themselves?
No, we don't. But listen, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience.